Andrea, you want to start? Say a few words?
Yeah, I think that the film is excellent. I think it's a nice overview of the conditions in the fashion industry. I think there are several questions it doesn't ask. There are many things in the film. I've watched it numerous times. I do show it to my students at both Parsons and at Pratt. If you recall, there was a British woman, and I'm not sure, I'm ignorant, and I hope I don't insult anyone, who went to a factory, a small factory, either in Pakistan or India. I wasn't sure where. I think it was, what? I don't think it was Bangladesh. It was a small factory where she was working on a dress with embroidery. And there was a very telling scene there where there's a whole, the managers of the factory and she are sitting up on chairs. And the women workers are sitting on the floor. And they are told that they will get to choose one of the best workers to go to London. Yay! And it is, I think back to the early fashion industry in the United States, which actually was why we had the slave industry, where people were owned in order to supply the fabric for the factories all over the world, in Europe and the United States. Because the United States supplied all the cotton, and we had the mills, and we made the fabric, the East Coast especially. 150 years ago, 2 miles from where we're sitting right now, human beings were bought and sold for this industry. And if you asked any of them to choose one of themselves, someone to go to London, yay, yes, I want to go. So I think, it still is a form of slavery that we see going on. And in terms of the film, nothing has changed, believe me. In January, 7,500 workers in Bangladesh were fired. There were demonstrations. Fire hoses and rubber bullets were used on the workers. 500 people are in jail under criminal charges. People were dragged out of their houses in the middle of the night, even if they thought you were at the demonstration, because they were asking for a raise from $69 a month to $96 a month, okay? Stella McCartney, who talked about doing what she could in terms of sustainability, and she is a leader in the industry in terms of producing what's called a P&L, a profit and loss publication, in terms of the effect on the environment, but we don't see it in terms of labor. The woman, I don't know what the organization she was from, who talked about what's called the 12 points, an organization called RAP came up with about 15 years ago, the 12 points that would certify factories in terms of being compliant. And those things include no child labor, no forced labor, medical help for workers, because the fashion industry is rife with what's called repetitive action injuries, similar to how you get carpal tunnel. You get it in your elbows, in your arms, in your back, your eyes. So there are 12 points. If you look at the largest association, the FLA, which is the Fair Labor Association, for the reports on the companies, you will see their action plans. They've certified Nike, okay? They've certified them, given them a platinum rating because they have a plan. We will provide 3 doctors every week for 1,000 workers. But no workers have ever seen those doctors, ever, okay? So it really goes back to the that whatever we're wearing today, well, not me, because I made what I'm wearing, what we are wearing, just like blood diamonds, we wear blood garments. We do. And so it really comes down to, just as we make choices as to what we will do ethically for work, what we do ethically in relationships, what we do ethically in terms of our political choices, we need to do in terms of our purchasing. And the same craziness we saw of those Walmart, people running in to buy things on Black Friday, This goes on every single night in New York City on the internet. On the internet. We are shopping like crazy for things to make us feel better. Excuse me? Not just eBay. Oh, Ebates. Okay. So it is the dopamine rush we get. The same brain chemicals take place as when we fall in love, when someone gives us a compliment, when we are appreciated. But the difference is, as far as I can recall, what happens chemically to our brains is that when we feel love, the reduction of those chemicals in our brain, those hormones and whatever they're called, has a very long kind of reduction. But when we buy something, it lasts for 15 minutes. And so what do we have to do? We have to buy more. And when I first started my education career, I was really committed to teaching the kids who needed me. And I left education because it's a very, very conservative environment. And I worked in it for 13 years. I ran art programs in 8 schools and felt that I had contributed the way that I wanted to for long enough. So now I teach the students who don't need me. They're very wealthy. They come from Asia, they come from Europe, they come from the wealthiest families all over the world. Their parents can pay $60,000 a year, buy them a car to have when they're in New York, buy them an apartment to have while they're in New York, because they want to be in the fashion industry. But what happens is the same, and in the film they call it the propagandizing that takes place through advertising. I just say to my students, it's called brainwashing, not propagandizing. It's brainwashing. We've all been brainwashed. And so I teach social justice. I teach the truth about the fashion industry. And I'm changing how the fashion industry operates, because these are the kids who are going to own the factories. These are the kids who are now leaving school with a very different idea of how they want to approach what they do. That we lift the curtain up, and especially because I teach at the new school, I teach in what's called a social justice hub. And it's our commitment to bring this information to our students. So is that enough of a yak? Okay, go ahead.
What I like about that film, and what I liked when the producers of it first came and talked to me about it, is summarized in the title, The True Cost. Because I'm an economist and I teach students, or I'm supposed to, how to do what they sometimes called cost-benefit analysis. It's a routine that is taught to students, undergraduate and graduate alike. And it goes like this. Capitalism is a great system, an efficient system, because every businessman or woman knows that you're only going to be successful if you earn more in revenue than it costs you to produce the thing. That's when you have a profit, when the revenue is larger than the cost. And therefore, if a capitalist can show you, an employer, that his or her costs are less than the revenues, not only does that person show you how and why they make profit, but we're all supposed to, as citizens, applaud this. This is efficient, because the capitalist is not going to do it if the costs are greater than the revenue, because that would be a losing proposition. And so we get only produced the things that are wanted, and therefore the revenue comes more than they cost to produce. Okay, this is a very nice story, but it makes one enormous assumption that this movie blows up. The assumption is that the costs calculated by a capitalist, a business person, are the only costs that are relevant. So you measure how many shirts are made, for example, and the revenue, okay, that's the income, and then you measure the cost. But we don't really do that. We only measure the costs that the capitalist has to cover. So we know he has to buy raw materials, and he has to buy some machines, and he has to hire workers. But all the other costs of the production process, many of them, he's not responsible for. So let's start with the children. If you put 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids to work, you damage them physically and you damage them mentally. Their costs of dealing with their physical ailments and their mental ailments will last the rest of their lives. Does the capitalist count the cost of that? No, because he's not responsible in this society for them. So the real cost of what's going into those sneakers or into that shirt is not what's actually measured. If you counted the costs, all of them, then it would never have been produced, because the revenues are far short of what the true cost of production is. Now, many Americans kind of get that with the environment. They kind of understand that if you're busy making something and you pollute the crap out of the air, that the people who get sick, or the products that wear out, or the laundry you have to do because the sheets are dirty all the time since the little particles settle on them, people kind of get, oh yeah, that it's those are not counted, but they really are a cost of this kind of production. So that's the beauty of this film. It tells you that in the clothing you wear, there is profit for sure. That's why it's produced. But is it efficient in the sense of only producing that which is more beneficial than it is costly? And the answer is no. In order to know what would be efficient, you'd have to know all the costs, the true cost of producing something. Otherwise, you wouldn't produce it. The end result of this is momentous. We don't live in an efficient economic system. We never did. The claim to efficiency of capitalism is fraudulent and always was. Because the notion that we're efficient, no capitalist would produce something that cost more than it gets in revenue, because that would be dumb. No, that's the norm of capitalist production. It's demonstrated here dramatically, and that's why it's a really good film. But the lesson here is general. Capitalists don't cover their costs. They aren't efficient. And in fact, any honest capitalist who were sitting here, and perhaps there is one, would tell you that. They only count the costs they have to pay for. All the costs they can offload onto others, like the very victims of their work processes, they don't have to count those, and they don't. So their little calculations of what's profitable, what's reasonable to produce, are based on only what they have to carry. And it's a fundamental understanding that the claims of capitalism to have come up with an efficient way, more than feudalism, more than slavery, more than earlier organizations of economics, is fake. It's self-promoting fraud, and it should be understood as such. If we were to have an honest counting, then there would have to be some independent agency, there is no such thing, that looked into what it really costs to produce this microphone, this shirt, these shoes, and so on. Like the film, in a way, starts looking into what are the real costs in the effect it has on people's lives, in the effect it has on the environment. But that can't be done because there's nothing in our society. There's no agency whose job it is to do that. Capitalists have never allowed such a thing because of what it would show, which is their calculations are only about the costs they have to pay. But the true costs are much larger, much more diverse, and they have simply escaped being responsible for them. And about the last thing I have to say is about child labor, because it raises such enormous questions. Capitalism as a system has always exploited children. Wherever capitalism has settled, one of the first things it does is go after the children. The little ones, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. pays them as little as possible, has them very docile, has them very supervised. And because they're children, they can't mobilize, or at least they can't do it very well, which is why they've been attractive, and the cultural enablement of paying them little. For those of you who don't know, the early textile industry in this country, among others, was full of child labor. It was a very serious problem. You know how capitalists defended it then? I'm talking 100, 150 years ago in the United States. Exactly the same way they defend it in Bangladesh now. They say, hey, this is really good that we hire children. These families are very poor, and this brings another income into the... See, we're noble. We're doing them a favor. And if you outlaw child labor, and don't disappoint here, if you outlaw child labor, we won't be able to help these poor families who otherwise could farm out their kids. Of course, the hidden understanding in that kind of an argument is that there are no alternatives other than hire or don't hire the child, as opposed to create an educational environment for the child where he or she can grow up. The arguments are always there to support child labor, to allow it, to even boast that it's a contribution to the society. That was done in the United States. And it worked for years. Until finally, it's very important everybody understands this, until finally the mass of parents of these children, the very parents who were supposed to be grateful that their child could earn some money and help the family, began to realize they were being destroyed, their children, in these places. They were subject to sexual, you can imagine, right? The sexual abuse, the abuse of every other kind, the maltreatment, the fact that they couldn't go to school and they interfered with their school even if they did go to school at other hours, etc., etc. It was stunting them. And the parents began a movement, no more. And it was thought, you can't do that. Capitalism is an efficient system. The capitalists said, we'll go out of business. I mean, these children are doing work and we're paying them, and it creates the profitability of the textile industry, and it will shatter the industry if we can't avoid children. To which the mass of parents here in the United States gave them, you can guess, which finger of the hand, and said, this has got to stop. And we finally passed laws that said, we don't care you can't hire children. That's it. It's done. And the answer of the radicals who pushed this through was, if you can't find a more humane way to produce clothing, then we won't have an industry of clothing in this country. We'll just buy it from someplace else. In other words, you'll have to solve this problem another way. And the important thing to understand is that's exactly what they did. They found other ways. Technology, machinery, and so on. They got the clothing produced. For the next 100 years, they did just fine because one horror was cut off. This is the exact same thing now. The only difference is it's black and brown children far away, rather than the children here. And we pretend it's not a problem because the clothes come from somewhere else, as you can see if you look on the label behind you. But it's just the export of the same horror with the same arguments for as long as they can get away with it, until everybody says, stop, you can't do that anymore, and then they'll have to find another way of doing it. Just like they'll have to find another way of producing that doesn't befoul the environment and wreck the rivers and pollute the air and so on. People can fight about these things and they can make progress. But capitalism will always be looking away for ways to make money by not counting the true costs. That is what the people have to do for as long as the capitalism is with us, which hopefully won't be too much longer.
Thank you both. Okay, so the first question we have is from Nate Church, and he writes a really, really long question. So I'm going to do my best to summarize what he asks. Do you think it would be feasible for human society to come up with a new system that might be called a democratically planned economy? One where we, the people, vote on what percentages of our human and natural resources we spend to create which products and services?
I just whispered to Rick, New York question. It's a statement, it's not a question. I think that the answer is, idealistically, yes. Under this current the political environment, I say absolutely not, because the politics are, our political system is here to protect capitalism. That's what it's here for. And we have, everyone who has a large corporation has lots of money to lobby, to put into office, the people who will protect their interests. I think sometimes, I also work for WBAI Radio. I do development for them. And when Trump got elected, I thought, this is the best thing that ever happened to WBAI, And we do see, a real resurgence of activism, which is very, very exciting. But it hasn't put more money in WBAI's coffers, I'll tell you that. I forgot the name of the documentary I saw recently on Channel 13, but it was about what was called death by despair. That Americans are dying from drug abuse, from alcoholism, and from suicide more than anything else. And these are the true costs of capitalism. We don't have communities to support each other. Families are being, have been, dissipated in terms of economic needs. We don't have small communities anymore. We have large cities where people are isolated, and we're living this technology-driven daily existence where we think we are communicating, but we're not connecting. We're not connecting as human beings. I do see, so much more activism, which is phenomenal. I think our coming election scares me terribly, But what it's also done is rooted out the true costs in many ways. With the rise in racism and anti-Semitism and misogyny, it's all come up to the surface. Here it is, okay? I don't know. That's all. That's what I've got to say.
I think there are ways that we could defeat this, but in order to do it, we have to understand what it is we're trying to defeat. And we have to face something which is sad, which is that for the last 100 years at least, Americans, large numbers of them, have understood that the system really doesn't work for most people. If you had doubts about it, the great crash of the 1930s kind of brought it home to you. If you imagined afterwards that we had learned how to avoid big crashes, well, the one in 2008 should have fixed that for you. Well, the inference here is that across the last 100 years, all kinds of people have proposed all kinds of reforms, things that could be fixed here, things could be adjusted over there. And they tried to make a progressive tax system. They tried to have Social Security so that some kind of decent support for older folks would be made available so they wouldn't have to lean on their own children for help. All of that. There were efforts made. But this system undermines all of that almost as fast as it's put there. As fast as for example, as the government created some controls over banks in 1933, because the banks had done pretty much what they did in 2008, led us into the disaster. They put a law, Glass-Steagall it was called, a control of the banks. The minute that was done, the banks went to work. For the first 15 years, they evaded the law. The next 10 years, they modified the law. And finally, when they were strong enough, they got, by the way, Bill Clinton to sign the law that annulled it. And 8 years later, the banks took us into another one. And this is not this one or that one's fault. It's how the system works. After this latest crash, we did it again with the banks. The Dodd-Frank law that some of you remember reading about, which wasn't much of a control anyway, but I don't know if you're aware of it, a good half of the things in the Dodd-Frank law passed 8 or 9 years ago still haven't been implemented. That's very complicated to implement this law. And others are already being weakened. You know how they're weakened? By the bank's lobbyists. And you know how the banks pay the lobbyists? With the bailout money you all provided to them. I mean, someday this will all be looked on by historians who will shake their heads in disbelief that the American people simply sat there like bumps on a log, letting all this happen, wishing it wouldn't hurt me or my family, which it inevitably, sooner or later, will. 7 countries in Europe now make all higher education free. Let me do that again. 7 countries in Europe now make all college, university, graduate school free. No tuition, no fees, free. The Germans go one step further. It's not just free for German citizens, it's free for anybody. You can leave the United States, move to Germany, and your university won't cost you a nickel in the way of a tuition and free. What? Was free in Hungary. Yeah, but well, before the changes, absolutely. In all of Eastern Europe, you had that was a commitment of those societies. But I'm talking about now and when it's been the West. By contrast, here in the United States, a land of the free and the home of the brave, et cetera, college is out of reach for most people, which is why we have the first generation of people dying from tens of thousands of dollars of debt coming out of college. The college degree is less useful in getting a job than it's ever been, costs more than it ever did, and therefore loads up a generation. What's going on here? Do American college students not understand the shafting they're getting? Well, the answer is they do, more than they ever have. They're learning that the American dream they were developed, trained to expect, isn't there. It's out of reach. They're never going to get it. It's gone. It is not coming back absent really fundamental change. We've tried reform. We've tried fixing it. That's a dead end. We've been there, we've done that, and it does not work. And sooner or later, that will be understood. I believe it's already underway. Well, what is it you do if you can't fix the refrigerator? You get a new one. If you can't fix an economic system, you got to try a new one, a different one. And the last thing I would say is, it's hard to do that. But that's not hard because it's a difficult topic. It's real easy. It's hard because we have all gone through an educational process in this country in which it was systematically taught to you, especially in economics courses. That's what I do for a living. I'm an economics teacher. The economics curriculum of every major American university functions as follows. Capitalism is the way it is. Capitalism is the only way it can be. Capitalism has always been there, and to think outside the box of capitalism makes you, at best, weird, and at worst, a lunatic. But here's the joke, which everybody understands. Every economic system the world has ever had, ancient tribal organizations, slavery, feudalism, communal every economic system that we've ever had as a human race for tens of thousands of years has the following characteristics. It was born. That is, it came into existence where it hadn't been before. Then it changed over time, every one of them. And then it died, just like people do. Why in the world would you believe that capitalism is the exception? Especially when I remind you that the people who thought about this in every other system, they too thought it was the exception, only it wasn't. Just like you know people who think they'll never die, and you actually know they will. And eventually they'll figure it out. So the question isn't what you might imagine. Can we do differently from capitalism? The question is, we know capitalism was born. We know it's been changing. So the next step, folks, is that it dies. And the really interesting question is, maybe it's already doing that. Maybe that's why Britain is falling apart with Brexit, or we have Trump. Craziness. These are signs of social dissolution. That's why we have people asking in public television, what's wrong with white supremacy? As Andrea said, it's bubbling back up. It's bubbling up because all of the mechanisms of society to contain these things are fraying. It's already here. It's only a question of whether we are ready to begin to make the change so we get what we want out of it and not sliding backwards into some disaster.
Yes, I would like to know, my question was, who decides need? And I didn't like the movie because it gave the impression that we're a consumer-driven society of greedy workers. But the real truth is, most of our wealth, 70% of it, goes to provide 1,000 military bases in 140 countries that gas and shoot down those workers that are trying to fight for decent living. And what we say is, oh, well, we should do things in an ordinary, reasonable way, according to what the movie said. But the main thing is anything we ever got with Social Security, anything, the civil rights, the end of the Vietnam War, was fought in the streets by workers. And any time we ever got anything was when it was revolutions, where workers try to change society. And the whole thing is, if anybody's interested, there's a paper that's trying to destroy capitalism, and I got it if anybody's interested.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. You know, right up the block here was a very important event in both labor history and in the fashion industry. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory took place here. And what woke people up was, well, first of all, it was the advent of photography and, you know, being able to see things, just like, you know, in the using, Twitter to, and why can't I talk? You know, I've been talking all day, that's why. Using Instagram and using, you know, your cell phone to video what's actually happening when it's happening. And so what happened then is that photographs were taken of young women floating to their death from these factories. The day that they had the funeral, the city was totally shut down. There were only 2 million people living in New York at the time, and they all lined Madison Avenue for the funeral for these young women. I mean, it was sexism, okay, but it woke people up big time, those visuals. And that's where our OSHA laws came from, and a lot of other, including the child labor laws, happened on the backs of those poor young women. But I saw the same exact conditions in this film. Yes. Same exact conditions. I was asked to do a line for a group of factories in China. And I knew one of the people who were related to the owners of these factories. This company owns 13 factories in China. And it would have been a very lucrative deal for me. And I would have had great, creative freedom. They wanted what I do. They had nothing like it. They wanted to get into this market. But she mentioned to me something funny about toilet paper. She told me that there's only toilet paper in the management offices. But the 1,000 workers who work in the factory, in all these factories, don't get toilet paper. Why? Because they steal it. That was the excuse, okay? So I think one of the things that the gentleman was talking about that I agree with is that in France, when things aren't going well, the country shuts down. They shut things down economically. They attack the capitalist system. We can't make money. That wakes people up. You look at the Intifada, where the women worked to get the stores shut down. That got Israel's attention, okay? So I think we are in the streets, but we don't take it any further. We don't, we have what is the one day without shopping that takes place after Black Friday? Yeah. There is one day, right? So, I think there needs to be that kind of action, really dramatic action, that we attack capitalism where it hurts, in the banks, and who we're buying from, what we're buying. Take a year and don't buy anything. See how it feels. See how it feels to not buy anything, just the essentials. Buy your food, pay your rent. I've done it. It's a very freeing feeling to be free of this whole nonsense, So.
I agree also with the gentleman, and let me give you an example where I think this is already happening. Several steps ahead of us in this country, which I hope we will follow. It comes right out of what Andrea was telling you. For the last 22 weeks, every Saturday, a movement in France called the Yellow Vests has been mounting demonstrations in cities large and small across that country, sometimes as many as 700 localities. People not involved in either of or any of the political parties, regular people who haven't been active in most cases before, put on a yellow vest. Everybody in France has one because the law in France is if you have a car, you must have in your trunk a yellow vest, a kind that reflects light. So if you're ever stuck at night, you can put this thing on. It's a safety measure. They also have those little red triangles that some of you know about that you put on the road where your car is. So everybody has a yellow vest. It was a very smart idea. Put on your yellow, get it out of your trunk of your car, put it on, and come into the streets with everybody. It began 22 weeks ago because of the rage of the population that their leader, I have to be polite, so I'm not going to say what I think about this leader, but here's a summary. He makes Trump look good, okay? Mr. Macaroon, which is what he should be called. Anyway, they were upset because Mr. Macaroon said he's concerned about the environment, and therefore to improve the environment, he's putting a tax on fuel oil, gasoline and oil. In other words, suddenly he's discovered the environment, he hadn't noticed it before, and the way to pay for it is to stick it to everybody who has to buy a gallon of gas, to make the mass of people, not the corporations and not the rich. And the mass of the French people did exactly what Andrea said. They said, okay, that's too much. That's that straw that broke the camel's back. We're not doing that. Of course the ecology has to be improved, but we're not going to pay for it. You are. And there it began. Okay, 22 weeks. The government has done everything to shut that down. Make fun of it. Make believe it isn't happening. Fill the Western press with notices. There aren't people coming out anymore. All fake. Didn't work. Repression. Beat up the people. Do the hoses on them. Didn't work either, even though 1 or 2 people got killed by the police, etc. Couldn't stop it. Couldn't get bigger and bigger, more and more militant. This last Saturday, they made a decision. For the next 3 weeks, they're not going to put on the demonstrations. They've proven that they're the most durable. Any of you who've ever been involved in organizing a demonstration, try to imagine what work it takes to do it for 22 weeks. That's short of half a year, not much short either, that they've been able to sustain a mass movement coordinated in every city. So they had an assembly on the outskirts of Paris. Of all the local ones, everyone sent 2 delegates, every town. Had to be, this was the rule, 1 man, 1 woman from all. And they met there as delegates of these hundreds of towns, and they issued a manifesto of what they're going to do. The next 3 weeks are going to be taken to organize not one here and there and the next one, like they did on Saturday, but they're going to take out the time and they are going to shut France down on May 1st. Whoa. And then in the manifesto you can read, which is the most important thing, the following sentence. This is the official document of this assembly. We recognize that what we confront in France is a global system. It has come time we must get out of capitalism. In French, for those of you who know, il faudra sortir du capitalisme. Sortir is the French verb get out of, as in you're contained in a trap or a box and you're going to get out of it. This is the biggest mass movement in many years. It's all over the country, and it has reached the conclusion in 22 weeks that the issue is capitalism. They demand that Macron go. They don't want to argue with him. They don't want to have a reform. They don't want him to pass a law. They want him out of there. And they want to get rid of capitalism. So stuff is happening and coming closer. It's not, the United States is not going to escape all of this. The forms will be unique here. They'll be different in every country. They don't have that, they do have yellow vests in other European countries, but not momentous the way it is in France. But I'm not arguing about what ought to be now. I don't have to. I used to do that. Now I can talk to you about what's already happening. So it's getting closer. Times have changed, and, it's also a sign that these meetings every month in this church are now a part of this church's life. We were brought into this church because the minister of this church said this kind of meeting with these kinds of discussions and what I do every other month that some of you come to is part of the mission of the church because they want to be part of what this change is. So it is already here. What is being asked for by this gentleman is underway, closer than you think.
We have time for 2 more questions, so if we can take the questions and then the responses after. Yep.
I want to ask, going back to the question of the French being able to shut things down. I've never been to France, actually, I've been to the airport several times, and every time I'm there, I'm always delayed because there's some kind of protest. Why are we unable to do that here the way they do it?
We're lazy. We're too busy. We're online shopping.
Professor, I'm just going to take the second question,
Oh, okay.
and that way. Where was it? I saw a hand. There, back there.
So you guys were talking about the concept of being in a post-consumerist society, and one of the things that the film brought up was the idea that, certainly in the case if we very suddenly all were to attempt, post-consumerism, like really cut down our consumption, that could create, economic issues, potentially job loss, et cetera. And I guess I'm just curious if you guys have any ideas about what would be a smart way to encourage post-consumerism so it doesn't, result in such a hasty,
Well, it's
problematic
not going to happen overnight, first of all, okay? So it is, from my standpoint, is influencing the industry as it moves forward. Young people who are coming into the industry, they're very smart. And they communicate with each other. And that goes with the same thing with the first question, is why we're not in the streets, is that we are addicted to binge watching on Netflix, for online shopping, from Instagram idiocy, okay? These are forms of distractions, distracting us from the unhappiness and the things that we can't control in our lives. So all these issues seem as if we cannot have an impact on it. So my feeling is, and what I suggest to my students is, you do what you can. You choose your battles. You make sure you are aware and not acting with blindfolds. And it's not just, it's a very difficult thing. It is. I'm an animal activist, but I'm wearing leather shoes, okay? So you have to do what you can, the best that you can. But in terms of changing how the system works, there are very interesting things that are going on out there. I've had students create QR codes that will come with your garment to show you the conditions of the factories where things are made. So you may make a different choice. But they're being innovative. They're using technology. But it's tough because they're all addicted now. You see babies in the subway on the iPhone. So, I'm getting them. They're already addicted. They're addicted to buying. They're addicted to not clothing, but to what we call fashion, which is a whole, they're two different things. And so they see their identities and their value is superficial. It's what they're wearing, their bodies, how their hair should be. Every part of our bodies has been attacked by the beauty industry, which is also a $64 billion industry attached to, there's all kinds of industries attached to this fashion industry. But we're seeing things change. We're seeing makeup for people with all different color skins. We're seeing different gender identities being represented. But it's still telling us we're not okay, that we need to be improved. The clothing, the makeup, the shampoo, now eyebrows. Eyebrows are the things. Like every inch of our bodies is being attacked that somebody can make money off of it, okay? So I think it's an act of really self-examination of what you're willing to participate in. I go, I live downtown, but I actually go around the Soho area, which, I grew up in this area and used to be a creative source of New York City. It's now a shopping mall where people line up with red ropes to get the opportunity to buy things now that cost $5 to make that they pay $500 for. I walk by and I say things to them. I'm fine with it. Like my friend and I were recently in front of one store. I just said, "It's disgusting. It's disgusting." So a woman said, "You're crazy." I'm crazy. I'm crazy.
Why we don't go in the street? Very important question. Is it something wrong with the American people? Are we chicken? Are we scared? What are we? And I think it's very important to answer that question. I don't think Americans are particularly that different from French people or German people or anybody else. So I have to ask the question, what might make Americans hesitant about doing things with other people to change the circumstances in which they live? Why are Americans so determined, each of them, and I'm exaggerating, but to get the point across, that he or she will cleverly escape all of these things we're discussing? He or she will figure out what courses to take, what university to go to, what part of the country to live in, so that they can escape what is the general malaise. That's called individualism. That's called thinking that you're going to solve the problem as an individual. You're going to slither out of the problem and look back and feel badly for those who couldn't, but you're proud you did. This is called an individualism, and individualism is a disease, whereas in this country it's celebrated as a virtue. And there's a reason for that. We didn't always do that. And the story is worth telling again. The last time the economy collapsed, the 1930s, the reaction in the United States was very different. In the United States, people in huge numbers joined unions to survive the Depression. Millions who had never been in a union, who came from families whose parents had never been in a union, they did this weird thing, and it was looked upon as very bad to do. They joined, millions of them. Others, tens of thousands, joined 2 socialist and 1 communist party. And the Communist Party and the big parties they were in this country, and they worked together with the unions, and they brought the great changes of the 1930s. That's why we have Social Security. Without socialists and communists and unions, there'd be no Social Security, there'd be no unemployment compensation, and there'd be no public jobs, and there'd be no minimum wage. All of those things were done in the 30s because those people went to the president and they basically said to Mr. Roosevelt, you've got to do something for the millions of people that are suffering. And the nice part of the message was, if you do that, we'll vote for you like we did, get you into office. The not so nice message was, you don't do it and you won't be dog catcher anymore. And Mr. Roosevelt understood he was talking to millions of votes. So he did it. He gave them Social Security. He gave them unemployment compensation. He made a minimum wage. All of these for the first time, never existed in America. And he hired 15 million people to give them money, give them a job, and let them keep their homes. And who paid for it? Corporations and the rich. I got to say that again. Corporations and the rich. He taxed them. Big increases. You're going to pay, he said, and you're going to be glad to pay, you corporations, because if you don't pay, there's going to be a revolution and you're not going to have any money at all. So give me half of what you got and you'll be able to keep the other half. And that was the deal. That's what happened. And the corporations had to pay, and they were not happy. And they had to pay to make average people have a better life. It made them doubly unhappy. But they bit their tongue because they were afraid. And then the war came. And now it's 1945. It's really important. Roosevelt dies. By the way, this president who taxed corporations and the rich more than they ever had been before to give a massive improvement to the lives of average people, this man who dared to do that political thing was reelected 3 times, the most popular president in the history of the country, which suggests how dangerous he was. How dangerous, because the people who knew that it wasn't Roosevelt. He didn't do anything. He was a middle-of-the-road Democrat. He did what he did because he had pressure from below, from socialists and communists and unionists who made it happen. So they understood after the war, they've got to destroy that coalition. They got to make sure this never happens again in America. So they looked at him and they said, who's the weakest link here? The communists. How do you handle them? You turn them around from being what they were in the 30s, the vanguard, the people who led the union struggles and won. You turn them into agents of a foreign power. Ooh, all the scary music. And you got rid of them. And as soon as you were done, you went around America and you said, you see those socialists over there? He's just the same as the communists. They just spell it differently. That's why Americans think socialists, communists, it's all the same. It's all the same. Every other country in the world knows what the differences are because you have a socialist party, a communist party, you have a sense of, in this country, socialist, communist, anarchist, Marxist, terrorist, Muslim. It's all the same. Because there's this, well, what is that? We terrorized the American people. From 1946, literally to the present, there's an endless drumbeat of the awfulness and the evilness. And don't ever get together with other people who talk like this, that there's something wrong with the system. You know, like I do. Keep away from these people. They're dangerous. They're going to get you into trouble. And Americans who don't know this story have imbibed the message subliminally into their brains. You know that sociologists in America, there's a guy named at Harvard named Robert Putnam, wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone. And in that book, he documents that Americans for the last 50 years have been more and more shy of being involved in anything. Anything. Including bowling leagues, which isn't very controversial. We are a society that has been traumatized. That's why we don't go in the street. We're scared without even knowing what it is. It's something our grandmother told us, don't do that, and it's stuck in our minds, and our mothers and fathers reinforced it. But you know, like in all psychotherapy, If you understand how we got here, that's then the way out. Because you're not anymore driven by an unthought through need, but you're now aware. If we become aware of why we don't go in the streets, the next week we will go in them.
Okay, I think Judy advanced.